Welcome back to Sikistan, and today we're talking about the kind of pros and cons of the situation Paddy the Baddy or Paddy Pimblett put himself in last year. So he was kind of notorious, or it came up a lot in kind of articles about him on Instagram and social media about how much weight he would gain in between fights. So at some point he was at least 20 kilos over fight weight between his fights during camps or before camp started. So after one fight finished, he'd gain nearly 20 kilos back up in weight. Now, I know UFC fighters in particular, of all martial artists and all even weight class athletes, are notorious for cutting huge amounts of weight and very, very aggressively. But we want to talk about why that is, the kind of some of the situational stuff that would happen around that when you gain so much weight in between fights in a kind of a speed strength sport, or a power sport I should say, like mixed martial arts. Now before we get going, I just want to say we're both huge fans of Paddy Pimblett, or Paddy the Baddy, so this is not in any way a kind of an attack on him. He's in recent times has fixed it this year, so if you watch his YouTube, which is very entertaining, he doesn't do these huge weight gains anymore. But I just saw it a lot again recently. It seems to come up a lot on social media because as Paddy's kind of fame is rising, his star is rising, that aspect of the huge weight gain seems to come up a lot. And so we just wanted to talk about it as a talking point, like we do with all things. So it's not really an attack on him in his situation, as he has addressed it and it's something he's fixing. But we still want to use it as a kind of an educational point and entertainment value for the you at Chubs.
Absolutely. It's definitely something as well if you're in a weight class sport or you regularly do weight cuts for fights or for competitions. A lot of what we'll talk about here will be very applicable to you. We'll probably talk about it in a few different areas. The first area will be actually training while overweight. The next area will be competition prep or fight prep. So when you're in camp, and what cutting weight might affect you, or how that might affect you in that camp. And then the next thing will be the actual acute effects, like in the competition itself. There's a load of things wrong with training massively overweight. So in this case, you're talking about training possibly as much as 15 or 20 kilos heavier than you will be fighting at. And when we're talking about training, this is where the majority of your year will be made up, right? If your camp is 12 weeks prior to a fight, you might have 3 fights a year. You're left with still a lot of time when you're not in camp. This will just be normal training days. You don't know when your next fight is. You're just showing up at the gym. You probably aren't doing a massive amount of volume, but still, if you're a professional fighter or semi-professional fighter, you spend a lot of time in this zone, right? The first thing we'd have, or the first issue we have with people being massively oversized while training in this area is they just become slow, right? So when you're bigger, to a certain extent, gaining a bit of size, becoming heavier, gaining contractile tissue will make you more powerful. It'll make you stronger. It'll allow you to hit harder, wrestle harder, pin people to the floor harder, and it will just allow you to be stronger in general, right? But that's to a certain extent, and once you start passing over those thresholds, it's like the difference in watching a heavyweight boxer and a lightweight boxer. The lightweight boxer is going to move an awful lot faster, not only in terms of the speed of their actual punching and striking, but also the speed they move around the ring with, right? That leads you in next then to the fact that the people you're sparring against are probably going to move slower than the people in those lower weight classes. So if you're in a striking sport like the UFC or like MMA in general, if you're fighting at 70 kilos, say, or 75 kilos, and you're walking around over 90 kilos in some cases, you're not going to be sparring with 70 kilo fighters all the time, because you'll run out of them. You'll end up injuring all of them, or they'll go away because they'll be sick of getting beaten up by a bigger person. So you'll have to find relatively similar sparring partners, and then you're sparring against slower people. So not only are you mechanically slower and it's more difficult for you to move fast, but now you're more used to a slow opponent, and then just those reaction times, those fast kind of decision making skills will go down slightly.
I think probably the biggest problem with the competition aspect of being massively overweight when you enter a camp is that the weight gain in this circumstance is not like an increase in weight class or gaining weight to move up a weight class. This is kind of a for want of a better word, letting yourself go sort of weight gain. So it's not, it's not a lot of contractile tissue or muscle mass. Mostly it's adipose tissue and water retention associated with the weight gain and the hormonal influences that causes. So in this scenario, the worst part about this is that your fighting camps, however long that goes out from your camp, is it becomes hugely influences your training camp. So it really makes the training camp or that training period about losing weight. It makes it a very important factor because it's essential for that fight to happen, or it's vitally important for that fight to happen that you lose that weight. So it's not something you can kind of deprioritize. It's not something you can put down on the list of priorities. So it can't be number one, I'm going to get better at fighting, I'm going to train hard, and then at like 6 or 7 I'm going to need to make weight. That number one is with an asterisk, that you make weight. So every decision you make in your training camp becomes about is this enough cardio for me to burn enough calories or increase the kind of put me in a necessary environment where I can lose weight consistently. So then you are more fatigued because you're likely going to be doing more cardiovascular work as it's an effective means of burning calories per se. So then you are reducing your ability to positively do other important skill factors. So like Paddy's striking, his jiu-jitsu, any number of aspects that he's focused on his training, his S&C work. He's all heavily fatigued from that kind of calorie deficit, but he's also fatigued then from that extra cardiovascular work that a lot of people will kind of have to do. Now there'll be some benefit of course for this because in MMA it's a hugely aerobically demanding sport, and it's very, very beneficial to have a large engine. But when you're doing this with all that other aspects, there's only so much kind of adaptation energy you have available to distribute to each of these attributes. So if you're burning calories, you're trying to lose weight, and you're trying to do all this training as well on top of that, essentially what you're doing is negatively affecting those other attributes because you're putting so much effort away from your main aspects and you're trying to really focus on something that's just not really positively influenced, or it's not really positive for your fighting.
I think as well there's a psychological aspect to the kind of constant grind of you training in a deficit. So for anyone who's been in a calorie deficit, you'll know that the first few weeks are probably not too difficult. But as you go further and further, particularly if you're concurrently training hard while in a deficit, as you get further into that and you get deeper into a calorie deficit, you get deeper into a training cycle, there is a psychologically fatiguing factor to that. And it's not just that it's psychologically negative to have such an off when you kind of, like as Gareth said, maybe for lack of a better term, leave yourself go. There's definitely negative connotations for that in terms of being a good athlete and keeping your mindset, but definitely in the camp itself, if you're trying to keep morale high and keep your concentration high and all those reaction times and stuff we've talked about, all these things are really, really influenced by our current blood sugar levels, our just general level of fatigue and how we're feeling. If everything feels like it's RPE 9 or RPE 10, it's going to be very hard to maintain that level of kind of optimism, that level of drive and that level of grit throughout the entirety of the training cycle.
So then during that training camp as well, we have the kind of macro and micronutrient we have the macro and micronutrient deficit that kind of comes along with the reduction in calories. So if they have very likely he does have a qualified nutritionist or experienced nutritionist, someone helping his nutrition, they're going to maintain as much protein as he possibly needs. So then we're left with reducing carbohydrates and fats. There's obviously an essential number of fats that he's going to need per day to just essentially stay alive and maintain a healthy weight, hormonal balance, etc. So then what we're kind of left with is reduction of carbohydrates. And so ultimately, when we're reducing calories, we're going to be losing or potentially losing the availability for other micronutrients. So that's literally things from like zinc, magnesium, copper, B vitamins, all the things you've heard about, magnesium, all of those things that are very important for function. And these things that are actually generally excreted more during high intensity training, your loss through sweat or the process that involved with muscle breakdown and repairing of muscle tissues. A lot of these micronutrients are used. So then we're just putting ourselves at more of a chance of becoming deficient in an elite athlete population as opposed to deficient in a general population. So we're looking at stuff like losing availability of those micronutrients or losing them faster. And because we're not eating as many calories, we're not getting in enough of volume of those into training. We're also then, because we can't reduce protein to a huge extent and we can only reduce fat to a certain extent, you're kind of left with carbohydrates being reduced. Carbohydrates are massively beneficial in the environment or the sport that Paddy is doing. So it's a very explosive sport. I know we said it, you require a large engine from it because it can go a long distance, the rounds keep going, but the availability of carbohydrates makes those explosive training sessions and training movements much more viable and much more productive. And so as you're reducing those, and given the training volume, he's almost certainly doing multiple sessions per day, you know, he'll very easily work through a lot of those the glycogen stores in his liver and muscle. He'll work through those quite aggressively in those intense training sessions, and by all accounts he trains very hard, so it's likely he'll work through those quite fast, you know.
I think the last thing you have to look at in camp for these athletes who are kind of quite heavy outside of camp and then trying to drop a lot of weight in that 10 or 12 weeks, the last thing there is like the feeling of losing strength and losing power as your body weight comes down, right? So we don't wholeheartedly agree with that thing of like mass moves mass, you know, because obviously contractile tissue and bones move mass, but it's important to note like all strength sports have weight classes for a reason. So heavier people can move more weight, produce more power, and you feel generally stronger when you're a small bit heavier. When you take the case of a fighter, if they're in the ring with someone and they're used to doing their grappling or doing takedowns as they're 90 kilos or as they're 85 kilos, they will almost certainly feel very, very different being a late 70s or early 80 kilo lifter or fighter trying to take someone down. The perceived lack of strength you'll have as you're dropping weight in an acute time period like that is just non-ideal in almost every case. And talking about acute time periods, that probably brings us on to the next piece. And the next piece is the acute cutting of weight around the fight, right? So this might be the week of the fight, it might be 2 days before the fight, or it might be the night before weigh-ins, right? In the UFC, they do weigh-ins the morning before the fight, so they usually have 24 to 36 hours, 36 hours between weighing in and then ultimately fighting. So they have a lot of time to rehydrate. This leads us to being very, very predisposed to water cutting. So for water cutting, people oftentimes think that somehow when people are fatter, they'll cut more weight. The more muscle mass you hold, the more potential you have to lose water weight. So water is mostly held in the muscle. What we're doing when we're cutting water is cutting out that water, depleting that glycogen from the muscle, then weighing ourselves in and then repleting those water stores and that glycogen back into the muscle. It's interesting when you hear Paddy talking about the cut for his most recent fight, how easy this cut is because he's leaner and he has a bit more muscle. He obviously talks about that muscle needing more energy, which is certainly valid in the case of kind of more long-term cutting. But the main thing you're looking at when you're cutting water weight is the amount of lean tissue you're holding. And obviously that lean tissue acts as a really, really good reserve for all of our all that fluid that you're eventually going to cut out in a 3-day or a 4-day water cut. The last thing you need to look at though when you're looking at rehydrating or dehydrating a fighter and then rehydrating him is UFC is a striking sport, and every time you take a strike to the head you want your brain to be in the best possible condition to absorb those blows, right? So brain tissue sits in many, many different forms. In some forms it's an almost liquid substance that has almost no physical structure. In different areas then it's more of a gelatinous substance with more defined structure around it. But what we do know about the brain is that the more hydrated you are, the better able you are to absorb a concussive impact and not have bad long-term outcomes from it, or just not get knocked out and lose the fight because of a concussion. So when you have somebody who is really going to have to cut water weight quite hard, so somebody who's holding a lot of fat and they have to deplete all the glycogen. So you're talking about the liver glycogen, the muscle glycogen, everything being depleted as much as possible, your blood volume being as low as possible because they're holding extra fat, and you can't really lose weight from fat when you're water cutting, so you have to lose it from absolutely everywhere else. In those cases you really are at risk, or you're at a higher risk of a concussive episode, rather than someone who is quite lean, cuts a small amount of water from the entirety of the body, and then as you rehydrate, that brain tissue rehydrates alongside it.
So I think that kind of conclusively sums up our thoughts on being heavily overweight. You'll have noticed that basically all of those are bad points. The only possibly good point is, if you've put yourself in that situation before one fight and you're massively overweight and you went through a particularly grueling cut to get to that fight, that period after where you have some downtime to kind of let yourself go, relax from the environment temporarily, is certainly beneficial for a reasonable period of time, not to an extreme extent where you just kind of go wild and let everything go, but that small period of time, for a couple of weeks where you can kind of be a normal person per se and not have to have that psychological constant barrage of cutting weight, training hard for a couple of weeks, an off season or a down period of training is certainly beneficial. But these will be needed less frequently, the less grueling you have of those weight cuts, so the less you go overweight in between fights influences these less, and they happen less and are needed less and for a longer period of less length of period of time after. If you're at a moderate cut, and a little bit more of an aggressive cut pre-fight the day before, when you get to those down periods, a couple of days, a week or two can in some scenarios be enough when you are recuperating from the fight, and you don't have to worry about doing another massive cut again if you keep your weight pretty moderate. If you are a combat sports athlete, we do have our Seek Strength for Combat Sports. It is a 10-week program, 4 sessions a week. 6 weeks are focused on strength training for combat sports athletes, so it's a lot of hypertrophy and strength work, and then the final 4 weeks are focused on power production. So in general, we have people either do this who have a lot of time to train. They will train those 4 sessions per week in those 7 weeks and get it done, and they will do between 2 and 4 sessions of their kind of sport specific combat sports training. Typically we like to see people finish that within maybe 2 weeks of their fights. We don't like to finish it on the week of the fight or the week before. A little bit earlier is better, and then kind of taper out your S&Z for the last couple of days, 10-14 days before the fight. We've a lot of people do it as well, is they'll run the 10-week program over 20 weeks, but they'll do 2 sessions a week. So they'll do 2 sessions of the combat sports program, and they'll do 2 sessions of their combat their sport specific activity, or they'll do maybe 3 of one or 3 of the other, depending on their availability and how much time they want to and have available to train. But it will work quite well if you taper it out like that. Thanks for watching.